welcome to Ideagen TV, powered by Azure and presented globally by Microsoft. Today, we are thrilled to welcome Robert Popovian, founder of Conquest Advisors, as part of the Ideagen Cloud, AI, and Innovation 2030 Summit Series. Robert, welcome.
Thank you, Ideagen, for inviting me to give this talk. My name is Robert Popovian, and the topic of my discussion today is going to be debunking the myth of who funds biomedical innovation. The public and private sectors play complementary roles in the discovery and development of new medicines. We all know that. Both segments conduct basic, translational, and clinical research. However, each sector's focus and funding are very different. The federal government, through the National Institutes of Health, is really responsible and the primary funder of basic science research in biomedical sciences. This research is essential for informing all medical progress, including the development of medicines. It's not just for biopharmaceuticals. Overall, 54% of basic science milestones are achieved by public sector and 27% by the private sector. The biopharmaceutical industry's role in the U.S. research ecosystem is to take the necessary risks and to undertake the drug development research required to advance basic science, which was done through NIH funding, into safe and effective treatments which are made available to the patient and end up in the patient's bedside as real medicines. Performing human trials, which the biopharmaceutical industry engages in, consumes about 80% of the total research and development costs that we invest in the US. The private sector by itself contributes about 70% of the US medical and health research development funding. And in 2018, the biopharmaceutical industry invested about $102 billion in R&D research, in research and development research. To just put it in context, compared to the NIH, which basically provided $35.4 billion, which 8% of that was related to drug development. Many studies have been done over time trying to depict that the government's role is much greater than the private sector role in development and specifically in the bringing to market products such as for biopharmaceuticals. A recently published study, despite many limitations, showed that 75% of medicines that were approved between January 2008 through December 2017 were fully funded from soup to nuts through the private sector, through the biopharmaceutical industry. That only 25% of approved medicines benefited from some public financing and support. Another study investigating the correlation of NIH-supported patents to FDA-approved drugs found approximately 90% of the FDA-approved medicines were not associated with any type of NIH funding. So 9 out of 10 drugs that came into the market basically were supported fully by the biopharmaceutical industry, which again supported the previous study that I mentioned. Despite this evidence, certain policymakers keep insisting that the government's role is much greater, that in fact, the private sector, all they do is basically take the science from the government-funded research and market these products. And to the effect that that is not the case. And as I've mentioned to you, and the data that does not support the assertion. And at the best of times, we need to keep in mind that the government and the private sector have a symbiotic relationship that needs to be preserved, and it's something that needs to be cherished because they play separate roles into bringing to fruition medicines that the patients are desperately in need of. And in fact, one of the best examples of someone who has spoken about this is the director of the National Institutes of Health, Dr. Francis Collins, who has said, "I can see an emerging pathway," and I quote, towards curing that disease using gene editing of bone marrow cells, but it will take the full intelligence, resources, and technology from the government, academia, and underlying private sector to make it happen. So it is the understanding of the researchers within NIH that the role that the government and private sector play in bringing medicines to the market. It's unfortunate that policymakers have not captured that and still have this false narrative, provide this false narrative that everything is funded through the government research and all new therapies have government research stamp of approval on it. And all pharmaceutical industry does is market those medicines. This is something that is not good for future innovation. And specifically, it's not good for patients who are in desperate need of cures and are needing specifically drugs that can manage their disease or cure them of the disease. So as individuals, we need to make sure that we have the right data when we are making policy decisions. And this is clearly in one case that although the data supports a narrative, which is very different than what you will hear from our public officials repeatedly over and over again, and that has happened over the last few decades. I want to thank Ideagen again for this opportunity, and hopefully it will be a great discussion on this topic. Thank you.